companies from investing in cost-efficient and effective technology. At the core of the Clean Air Act is the idea that we can protect our environment without sacrificing economic growth. In the decades since it passed, the Act was largely successful in accomplishing this goal, but that success is threatened by outdated provisions that do not function well today. Clean Air Act, as it stands, holds outdated provisions that punish American job creators for emissions they have no control over. It discourages wildfire mitigation measures, threatening this country's air quality. It risks our economy and national security because of pollution that comes from outside the United States. It threatens our ability to stay competitive in the global artificial intelligence race. Most importantly, it inhibits the United States' ability to meet our domestic energy needs. Americans care about clean air. They also care about rising electricity costs in our economy. They understand that excessive regulation and outdated statutes do not equate to good or effective regulation. They care about technological advancement, not punishing American companies who lead that advancement. The witnesses we hear from today have extensive experience with the challenges presented by these outdated provisions and are well suited to explain their impact. I look forward to their testimony and their feedback on the discussion drafts. In June, we held our first hearing on the need to update the Clean Air Act. At that hearing, we heard testimony from about the billion-dollar price tag from Clean Air Act regulations doing little to improve air quality and the state of our economy. At that hearing, my colleagues across the aisle were critical of the proposals discussed because reforms were discussed in prior Congresses. They challenged us to introduce novel ideas to reform the Clean Air Act. It's feedback we took seriously. I encourage the panel of witnesses before us today to give us their best solutions for modernizing the Clean Air Act, both novel and previously discussed. Some of these solutions may not be novel, but our permitting problem isn't novel either, and it is not getting better. 35 years have passed since this committee meaningfully updated the Clean Air Act. It is our job to make sure that legislation passed out of this chamber is functioning effectively and is updated when needed. Let's take this opportunity to modernize out-of-date legislation and create an effective permitting program that works for the American people. I thank the members of the committee who are leading these efforts, and I hope my colleagues take the opportunity to engage in meaningful permit reform. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, my friend from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. I especially recognize Ms. Coons with Micron. Micron is making historic investments in upstate New York, creating thousands of well-paying jobs and revitalizing communities that have been rusty in recent decades into hubs for the next generation of advanced manufacturing in the United States, and we're most appreciative. Grateful for those investments to breathe new life into our region and help secure our nation's future economic competitiveness in such an important and strategic industry. This is an exciting time, but I also recognize there is a right way to develop these types of projects, one that allows for community engagement and mitigation of environmental harms. And there's a wrong way where we cut corners, take shortcuts, and exempt our way out of needing to care about pollution and its health consequences. While I do not doubt that some Clean Air Act permitting processes could be re-examined, we should not overlook how effective the law has been historically at allowing our economy to grow while reducing dangerous air pollution. And as I've said at past hearings, I do not take this past success as evidence that we require a dramatic departure from the law. On the contrary, there is still much more work to do to ensure all Americans can breathe healthy air. More than 156 million Americans are living in places with unhealthy levels of ozone or particle pollution. This is not the first set of proposals to reform the Clean Air Act examined by the subcommittee this year. And much like that first slate, I have serious concerns with each of the bills before us today. Of all of the bills on the docket, I want to single out the Air Permitting Improvements to Protect National Security Act, which would create a new presidential exemption in the Clean Air Act. Unfortunately, we have already seen EPA and President Trump completely abuse the exemption process established in Section 112I4 of the Act for National Emissions Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. EPA solicited requests for exemptions from regulated entities, and the President has granted them with essentially no public process or justification. This is a horrible, opaque way to manage environmental regulations, allowing the president to handpick individual firms, potentially for political reasons, to receive special treatment at the expense of the people that live near these polluting facilities. Creating another presidential exemption process after seeing how the existing process has been so brazenly abused by this administration would be a dereliction of our duty as the subcommittee with jurisdiction over the Clean Air Act. But with that said, I know there remains significant stakeholder interest in Congress pursuing some version of bipartisan permitting reform. From my perspective, those negotiations cannot happen while the Trump administration continues to provide zero confidence that any bipartisan agreement in Congress would be honored and implemented as intended. There is a long and growing record of the Trump administration playing favorites among certain technologies and individual firms, doing favors for political allies, and threatening retaliation against those that object. Meanwhile, EPA is carrying out a deregulatory agenda that is eroding critical public health protections, including numerous air pollution rules that would have saved thousands of Americans' lives. This is not fostering a foundation that will allow bipartisan negotiations to succeed. Finally, I suspect that today it might be suggested that the Clean Air Act has gone 35 years without a major overhaul and is in need of modernization. Well, people might be surprised to hear that I do not disagree, but modernization of our bedrock environmental laws should not just be a shorthand for enacting a deregulatory agenda. We should consider the challenges our country is facing at this moment and develop targeted solutions for them. The 1990 amendments tackled many of the issues of that era, including establishing the acid rain program and putting new emphasis on addressing hazardous air pollutants. Today, we should seek to provide similar regulatory certainty to meet our current moment. If we are serious about modernizing the Clean Air Act, let's start by enacting a long-term program to phase down greenhouse gas emissions. I would welcome the conversation with the majority about how we can provide appropriate regulatory certainty and compliance flexibility while still allowing us to reduce this dangerous pollution and indeed grow our economy. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your opening statement and for my friend from New York's opening statement as well, that we can work on what we know is a common goal, is that we beat China, and we have to have the energy and the resources to do it. And I know it's and we have to have the permitting, and so we can move the energy and resources to do it. And so America's job creators have been forced to confront burdensome and unworkable regulations that cost and create unnecessary barriers to growing their businesses. And today we'll have a panel of witnesses, thank you all for being here, that will testify about the need to pass common sense clean air permitting reforms to reduce unreasonable regulatory burdens while continuing to protect our environment. Protecting our environment and strengthening our economy are not mutually exclusive. As we heard in our hearing in June on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, regulatory burdens from the Biden-Harris administration cost nearly $1.8 trillion, and more than 70% of the cost was imposed by the EPA, primarily from Clean Air Act rules. Permitting requirements under the Clean Air Act are often cited as overly complex, time-consuming, and costly. They also often serve as a disincentive to building new or expanding existing infrastructure and manufacturing, even if the project would be better for the environment. Substantive permitting reform under the Clean Air Act is needed for the U.S. to strengthen domestic manufacturing, build critical infrastructure, and meet the growing energy needs and win the AI race. H.R. 161 was introduced by Representative Griffith, and our 4 discussion drafts we will discuss today would make targeted changes to the Clean Air Act. They would not gut the Clean Air Act. Instead, they are sort of common sense solutions we need. Our witnesses today will share their firsthand experience with the current regulatory system and challenges they've encountered while trying to grow their business or strengthen their local economies. This committee has a unique opportunity to enact meaningful reforms, and I'm eager to collaborate with members of this committee as we work to consider and achieve the necessary reforms. I appreciate the time, and I will yield back.
Gentleman yields. The ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, is submitting his opening statement for the record. Therefore, It concludes the member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members, and pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. I'd also like to remind members that the 5-minute question rule will be strictly enforced today. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from the members. Our witnesses today are Danny Seiden, President and CEO of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry; Ashley Coons, Senior Director of Environmental Health and Safety at Micron; Carrie Powell, Senior Attorney for Community Health and Air Program Leader at Southern Environmental Law Center; Mark Jevia, Vice President for Environmental and Permitting at Williams Companies; Ali Mirzak-Halili, Air Quality Division Administrator at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality; and Clint Woods, Commissioner of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. Thank you for being here today. Are we swearing in our witnesses? Okay. Thank all of you for being here today. Mr. Seiden, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Tonko, Full Committee Chair Guthrie, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Danny Seiden. I'm the President and CEO of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I'm here today on behalf of Arizona businesses, both large and small. At the Arizona Chamber, we represent every sector of our state's economy, from mining to manufacturing, energy, healthcare, and technology. I'm also happy and proud to be here in coordination with the National Association of Manufacturers. The issues we're discussing here today are very personal for me. Before leading the chamber, I worked for Intel, where I saw the impact firsthand of federal permitting decisions have on investment, innovation, and jobs. I've seen how businesses of every size invest heavily in cleaner technologies because they want to be good stewards of their communities. That experience drives my perspective today. Arizona businesses aren't asking for a free pass, they're just asking for a fair chance to grow responsibly. Arizona is at the center of America's growth story right now. We are attracting historic levels of investment in industries that are vital to outcompeting China, strengthening our national security, and providing for our clean energy future. A symbol of that growth is TSMC's decision to invest $165 billion in Arizona, the largest foreign direct investment in United States history. This didn't happen by accident. It's a product of years of smart policies in a competitive environment. Since 1990, our state's population has skyrocketed. Our GDP has risen by over 550%, and vehicle miles traveled have soared. Yet overall emissions are down 70%. That's proof that economic growth and cleaner air can go hand in hand. Despite this progress and continued rigorous efforts to reduce emissions, Arizona continues to face ozone challenges driven by factors outside of our control. In fact, approximately more than 80% of our ozone comes from other states, from Mexico, from Asia, and natural events like wildfires. Matter of fact, even if we were to shut down every industrial source in the state and took every car off the road in Phoenix, an area the size of the state of Connecticut, we would not meet the standard. Still, Arizona's businesses are penalized as if they are responsible. This is not just a regulatory burden. It is an economic and strategic threat that could result in projects vital to national security being delayed or stopped. If companies can't build here, they'll build somewhere else, likely in countries with weaker standards, and that's a lose-lose scenario. To make matters worse, unlike states with long industrial histories, Arizona, which is the newest state in the Great 48, has no emission reduction credits or offsets to rely on. So when a new facility wants to break ground or an existing one wants to expand, there's no offsets for them to purchase. Our bank is empty. It's a regulatory dead end, and innovative industries that would reduce emissions long-term are blocked from growing. Arizona is at the tip of the spear for this issue. As we continue to bring back manufacturing to America, though, more states will face this problem, especially if standards continue to be set at or below natural background levels. I do want to briefly recognize progress already made under EPA Administrator Zeldin's leadership. Administrator Zeldin came to our state very early on, and he took action by rescinding outdated Section 179B guidance, signaling flexibility on unfair non-attainment classifications, and recognizing the difference between controllable and uncontrollable sources. EPA is moving towards fairness. But what struck me the most about that meeting wasn't just the policy, it was the people in the room. We had leaders from statewide and local communities. We had elected Democrats, elected Republicans. We had past elected officials. And everyone in the room were all rowing in the same direction. This shows what is possible when we prioritize solutions over politics. Congress and this committee can now build on this progress through 6 reforms, which I'm glad to discuss in detail during Q&A. The first, protecting competitiveness by keeping standards realistic. Second, codifying reforms to Section 179B. Incentivizing upwind controls. Fourth, modernizing permitting. Fifth, encouraging innovation and collaboration. And finally, sixth, strengthening cooperative federalism by allowing states to approve projects if EPA fails to act within a reasonable timeframe. These reforms will help give private sector and investors certainty. Arizona is now a global hub for advanced manufacturing. Our request is simple. Give us the flexibility and tools to continue to reduce emissions while ensuring that industries vital to Arizona and the United States economy are not sanctioned out of existence. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Coons for 5 minutes.
Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today to represent Micron Technology regarding the importance of permitting reform in our broader conversations of invigorating American manufacturing. My name is Ashley Kuntz, and I serve as a senior director responsible for environmental health and safety for Micron's U.S. expansion projects in Idaho and New York. Micron was founded more than 46 years ago in Boise, Idaho as a technology startup. Today, Micron is a world leader in the design, development, and manufacturing of memory and storage products and is the only U.S. semiconductor manufacturer with technology leadership. Micron has announced the largest private investment in memory manufacturing in U.S. history of up to $150 billion for domestic memory manufacturing and $50 billion for research and development, creating as many as 90,000 U.S. jobs and strengthening the U.S. supply chain for the technologies that power everything from mobile devices to automobiles to artificial intelligence and advanced defense systems. Semiconductors are at the backbone of the modern economy, and yet over the past several decades, advanced chip manufacturing has largely shifted overseas. That imbalance puts our economy and our national and economic security at risk. Rebuilding this capability here at home is an area of bipartisan consensus. We appreciate the subcommittee's bipartisan leadership on permitting reform, and we urge you to continue to drive progress here. But I want to be candid about challenges that we face. We are doing our part to make sure our planned expansions are at the cutting edge of innovation, efficiency, environmental stewardship, and sustainability. Our facilities are expected to achieve a minimum of gold LEED status by adopting design, construction, and operational efficiencies. We use smart controls, energy recapture from tools, water reuse and recycling, among many other innovations. But our innovations won't be enough to maintain competitiveness. We need to ensure that the regulations keep pace with our industry's manufacturing expansions. Micron is committed to environmental stewardship and compliance with regulations and standards, and we support the health-based objectives of the PM 2.5 rule. We also support updates to the permitting process that will facilitate necessary industrial growth. Our facilities are designed with multi-million-dollar available control technology to reduce emissions, as well as other design features, such as limiting the number of emissions-generating equipment. And last year, Idaho's Micron campus won awards from both the EPA and Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry for pollution prevention, particularly with acknowledgments for above and beyond emissions reduction. Allowable levels within the PM 2.5 standard was recently reduced from 12 micrograms to 9. Our Idaho and New York projects are located in attainment areas for PM 2.5, where baseline background levels are already around 6 micrograms. In Idaho, wildfire smoke has become increasingly common and an uncontrollable contributor to PM 2.5. Working to codify the definitions within the standards around wildfire events could assist in providing meaningful clarity. And not getting this right affects not only Micron's investments, but America's broader efforts to restore semiconductor leadership. If permitting stalls key projects, the U.S. would fall behind, undermining economic competitiveness. We appreciate the committee's review of the Clean Air Act, specifically the permitting process, and ask the following. Consider a range of reviews from the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Support the EPA in providing timely guidance to states and permittees. Support investments in modernizing required permitting tools and staff resourcing at the local, state, and federal levels, and address any duplications within regulations. To close, Micron's business is memory and chip development and manufacturing, and we are fully committed in investing in American manufacturing and to environmental stewardship. and we work very hard to ensure environmentally compliant and safe operations where we work and live. And we believe there is room for improvement and efficiency gains within the permitting process that can preserve both environmental integrity and U.S. competitiveness. Micron is ready to do its part, and we look forward to continuing to partner with this subcommittee and with Congress to ensure the United States remains a global leader in semiconductor manufacturing and technology. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Coons. Ms. Powell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to the members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify today. My name is Carrie Powell, and I am the Air Program Leader and Senior Attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center. SELC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan legal and policy organization dedicated to protecting the health and environment of communities across the Southeast. The Clean Air Act, at its core, is a public health law. Its standards are designed to protect health with an adequate margin of safety. That phrase reflects Congress's intent to protect even the most vulnerable children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing illnesses. The Clean Air Act's results are striking. By 2020, the Act prevented 230,000 premature deaths annually. It reduced asthma attacks, heart disease, and respiratory illnesses. As documented by EPA, the Clean Air Act's benefits exceed its costs by a factor of more than 30 to 1. The Act has allowed us to breathe cleaner air, avoid premature deaths, and grow our economy at the same time. I'm here today to talk about the critical importance of Clean Air Act permitting in achieving these goals. These requirements are not needless paperwork. They are central to effective implementation. Strong clean air protections are implemented through permits. Rather than weakening this essential tool for protecting air quality, Congress should be providing more support to state and local agencies charged with issuing and enforcing air permits. They need technical and scientific support, legal support, and funding. What they do not need is fuzzy requirements full of loopholes that prevent them from issuing strong permits needed to protect public health in their communities. The proposals before you today would undermine the Clean Air Act's legacy of protecting public health. But that's a sacrifice we don't need to make. We can have both healthy air quality and robust economic growth. The Clean Air Act's new source review permitting program works by requiring large new facilities to utilize modern pollution controls and requiring existing large facilities to do the same whenever they make changes that will significantly increase their emissions. In other words, existing facilities must modernize their pollution controls at the same time that they modernize their industrial processes. It's how we avoid locking in dirty technologies for decades to come. Far from improving new source review, the so-called New Source Review Permitting Improvement Act would essentially eliminate NSR for changes made to our nation's largest industrial sources. Instead of requiring NSR for facility changes that increase actual emissions that worsen air quality, the bill alters how we measure pollution. It also creates a loophole that excludes a host of other changes. The effect of this bill would be to enable a source to make a change that vastly increases its actual annual emissions without installing modern controls or ensuring that the increased air pollution will not make air quality unsafe. Communities that are already overburdened with highly polluting facilities would bear the brunt of this rollback of NSR safeguards. Not only would they be exposed to more pollution, but they would also be shut out of participating in decision-making regarding whether pollution increases should be allowed. The proposed air permitting improvements to Protect National Security Act would authorize the president to exempt specified types of new highly polluting facilities from the requirement to offset the new pollution they will cause with air pollution reductions within the same airshed. It is important to recognize that these offsets are only required in places where air quality is already unsafe. We do not need to put the health of the American people in jeopardy to encourage economic growth. Any exemption from pollution offset requirements is highly concerning, but the presidential exemption from offset requirements is especially problematic because there are no public health guardrails. It does not require a factual justification, and it's granted without public participation. The proposed bill would also create a pay-to-play loophole, authorizing state permitting agencies to allow alternative offsets or charge a fee in place of real enforceable air pollution reductions. Again, this is an idea that would put communities at risk who are already suffering from air quality violations. There would be no guardrails to ensure that these offsets actually occurred. I'm not addressing the fences, fire, and red tape bills in my oral comments due to time constraints, but SELC opposes all of them. Please see my written testimony for details. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Powell. Mr. Gebbia, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Palmer, Vice Chairman Crenshaw, and Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Mark Gebbia, and I'm the Vice President of Environmental, Regulatory, and Permitting at the Williams Companies. I am honored to be invited to discuss ways we can work together to unleash American energy while also protecting the environment. Supplying the world's energy needs while protecting the environment is one of the greatest challenges of our time. Today, as one of the nation's largest energy infrastructure providers, Williams is responsible for handling approximately 1/3 of the nation's natural gas through 33,000 miles of pipelines across the United States. Our operations include gas gathering, processing, storage, and transmission. We directly serve over 600 utility and industrial customers, and we indirectly serve over 35 million energy consumers. Williams is driven to meet the world's need for clean, affordable, and reliable energy by providing the necessary infrastructure to serve growing markets and safely deliver natural gas where it is needed most. We take pride in our safety-driven, continuous improvement culture, and we lead with authenticity, creating connections to lead our industry into the future. Williams remains steadfast and focused on applying pragmatic solutions to further decarbonize the natural gas value chain, while at the same time exploring and advancing the next generation of emission reductions technologies and energy infrastructure solutions. As outlined in our most recent sustainability report, we replaced 92 compression engines in 2024 as a part of our global emissions reduction program. We held our absolute carbon emissions flat in 2024, even as our operations grew significantly. We became the first major U.S. midstream company to join OGMP 2.0, an international initiative for transparent methane emissions reporting. Further, we continue to develop and invest in alternative low-carbon technologies, such as independently certified next-gen gas, carbon capture and sequestration, solar, and battery storage. Our investment in energy infrastructure creates thousands of direct and indirect jobs, supporting skilled labor and stimulating local economies. Williams knows how to responsibly and sustainably build and operate energy infrastructure. And by focusing on turnkey power generation solutions for hyperscalers, we are supporting America's ability to win the race against China for artificial intelligence. The United States is facing a surge in energy demand driven by the rapid expansion of AI technologies. Electricity demand increased 5% between 2010 and 2024, with most of that growth captured in 2024. It's forecasted to increase 32% between 2025 and 2040, driven by the emergence of large load data centers and increased electrification of transportation and heating, along with industrial reshoring of manufacturing facilities. There are approximately 175 data centers planned or under construction within 50 miles of our transmission pipeline footprint. While Williams does not expect to capture every data center opportunity, we are well positioned to provide energy and ensure reliability for this growing source of demand, notably with behind-the-meter natural gas power generation. However, several legacy EPA air permitting regulations, originally designed for coal-fired plants owned by electric utility companies, are creating delays and costs that do not align with the nature and needs of these cleaner, modern facilities. Congress can amend programs and statutes implemented by EPA to provide clarity needed to help accelerate construction timelines, reduce permitting burdens and delays, and align with national goals for energy reliability, security, and AI leadership, without compromising environmental protections. These reforms outlined in my testimony would clarify that innovative gas-fired technologies and behind-the-meter facilities are not swept into outdated steam, electric, or utility categories that trigger unnecessary new source review thresholds. remove these same facilities from legacy trading programs such as the acid rain and cross-state air pollution programs that were never intended to apply to sources that do not sell power to the utility grid. Expand the pre-construction activities a developer may perform at its own risk, shortening project timelines without compromising air quality. Avoid making data center owners subject to permitting responsibilities for on-site power generation units that are owned by others. And ensure that Section 111 greenhouse gas standards for utilities, now proposed for repeal, cannot be misapplied to behind-the-meter units. I've outlined additional reforms Congress should consider in my written testimony. Pipelines power America, and our country and its citizens have received the benefits of this large-scale infrastructure for years. Clarifications to the application of federal air regulations to modern behind-the-meter data center projects will ensure that the United States can win the race for AI without compromising environmental protection. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the committee, this concludes my prepared statement. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Mazzeccalilli for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. My name is Ali Mirzakhalili, and I serve as Oregon's Administrator of Air Quality. I also co-chair the National Association of Clean Air Agencies Permitting and New Source Review Committee. In addition, I served for 2 decades as Delaware's Director of Air Quality. My testimony today reflects years of experience working with the Clean Air Act in East and West, and many years of issuing permits in attainment and non-attainment areas. Thank you for the opportunity. Since the Clean Air Act was last amended 35 years ago, it has prevented literally hundreds of thousands of premature deaths, as well as averted millions of incidents of morbidity, including, for example, heart disease, cancer, chronic bronchitis, and asthma. We have accrued these health benefits cost-effectively as our nation's gross domestic products has grown. Therefore, as the committee considers revising the Clean Air Act, it is important to remember those outcomes. Will the proposed revisions continue to preserve the substantial public health benefit from pollution reduction while accommodating economic growth, or will they break with that fundamental tenet? I will start with New Source Review Permitting Improvement Act. The proposed changes are concerning in several ways and would not improve overall efficiency of permitting by states because of added complexity. Many facilities are not equipped with continuous emission monitoring, and assessing accurate emissions on an hourly basis in such an instance may require producing multiple other records, such as production rates, material usages, control equipment and operating records, and much more. The permitting agency will need to review and accept the data as valid before it can decide that the future emissions will not be higher than historical data. The proposed language in II exempts modification that will restore, maintain, or improve the reliability of operations at or the safety of the source. It is hard to imagine any modification at any source that would not qualify under this exemption. This act, as written, would likely exempt all existing facility changes from review. This could therefore allow considerable air quality degradation and public health impact. I've gone into more detail in my written testimony. The Fire Act contains a few ambiguities. I support increased pace and scale of prescribed fires as a wildfire mitigation tool, but this bill's reach goes beyond the title. These proposed changes appear to be an attempt to allow rebranding of poor air quality by excluding data that may have been caused by stagnation, hot days, or dry days, which are the exact condition when we experience air pollution. The implication is that air quality agencies will need to concern themselves with providing good air quality on good days. This feeds into the mistrust that the public and certain advocacy groups have voiced in the process of exceptional events altogether. I've gone into a bit of detail on Oregon's West Bend pilot project in my written testimony. I will be happy to share our experience with the committee. NAAQS compliance is not the barrier to expanded wildfire mitigation, and I urge the committee to consider including funding and resources for planning, outreach, and engagement activities, including adequate resourcing of federal, state, and local partners involved in this work. The Red Tape Act implies that it intends to eliminate duplicative reviews. However, it removes all environmental impact reviews of subsequent federal actions that may flow from the legislation. The consequences of this could be a late realization of environmental impact, delays in permitting, and cost overruns. The Fences Act introduces significant complications for administering a permitting program, which I presume are unintended. Essentially, a new permit cannot be issued to any facility under this construct, no matter how well controlled, because the background concentration already exceeds NAAQS, and attainment permitting rules cannot allow that. Finally, Air Permitting Improvement to Protect National Security Act provides a waiver for offsets required in the non-attainment areas. Like my comments on the New Source Review Permitting Act, I believe that the proposed bill, if adopted, would have unintended consequences. Emissions from a source that receives a national security waiver may push an airshed further into non-attainment, triggering more stringent requirements like increased offset ratio and additional regulatory burdens. In conclusion, the proposed amendments fail to preserve the fundamental tenets of the Clean Air Act, which is to protect public health while providing opportunity for economic growth. The proposal allows significantly more pollution by introducing new off-ramps and exemptions. We can do better to improve the processes instead of focusing on off-ramps. So I think we must do better. I'm happy to engage with the committee with additional suggestions. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Mr. Woods, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Clint Woods, and I have the privilege to serve as the Commissioner for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, or IDEM, an agency of nearly 800 tremendous public servants who are on the front lines of implementing federal and state environmental laws and regulations for air, land, and water quality. I want to thank you for the attention for the subcommittee on this important topic, and I also wanted to express my appreciation for the hard work, professionalism, and dedication of your staff. I had the honor of serving for several years in this building as a professional staff member with the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and the opportunity to find bipartisan solutions for environmental policy is one that I think all the panel members would strongly agree with. In my testimony, I'd like to highlight 4 things. One, I'm still relatively new in my role and new to Indiana, so Hoosier humility hasn't rubbed off on me yet. So I want to brag a little bit about incredible success that we have in state permitting efficiency, in striking the right balance between environmental protection and economic prosperity, and also the incredible progress that Indiana as a microcosm for the U.S. has had in improving air quality. And to underscore the point that one of the primary ways to get to permitting reform and from gridlock to growth is in many ways to get the federal government out of the way. Secondly, I wanted to emphasize 4 key issues with our existing Clean Air Act that don't match the current environment for improved air quality. Third, I'd like to describe how the bills being considered today will help address those issues. And finally, discuss a few common sense areas where there may be opportunities for bipartisan collaboration. As you all know, the Clean Air Act is built on a model of cooperative federalism between the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and state and local agencies, with Congress repeatedly in amendments to the underlying act recognizing that, quote, air pollution prevention and air pollution control is the primary responsibility of states and local governments. That's certainly true in Indiana, where we have the primary responsibility for implementation of the Federal Clean Air Act, including nearly all monitoring, planning, permitting, compliance, and enforcement for air quality on behalf of Hoosiers. For us, that means 100% of key air permits in the state and over 99% of Clean Air Act compliance and enforcement activities are conducted by IDEM versus US EPA. And IDEM succeeds in that permitting. We beat state permitting deadlines by roughly 50%, issuing air, water, and land permits in a few short months compared to the years it often takes in other states. Our air permitting program, despite having more industrial sources than nearly any other state in the country, has the lowest permit renewal backlog among industrial states, as well as a robust, public, and well-supported process for developing, reviewing, and issuing permits under the Clean Air Act. In part due to this environment, Indiana ranks as the top state in the country for manufacturing per capita, as well as the manufacturing share of GDP, near the top in future economic outlook, and forecasts nearly $100 billion in additional economic value for Hoosiers from artificial intelligence investments over the next decade. We intend to continue as a beacon of investment for artificial intelligence, manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and life sciences. And while we're currently the world's capital of production of key products, including RVs and ducks and popcorn and pontoon boats and goldfish and high school basketball, we intend to expand that list in the coming years. State-led implementation of the Clean Air Act has served our country incredibly well, and one of the greatest stories seldom told is a monumental improvement in ambient air quality and emissions, progress that outpaces the rest of the world. For example, in Indiana, we meet or exceed nearly all national ambient air quality standards, or NAAQS. These trends have actually accelerated. For example, since 2002, aggregate emissions of criteria air pollutants like ozone, particulate matter, and lead have fell in Indiana by more than 65%. Sulfur dioxide concentrations in southwest Indiana have dropped by nearly 80% just since 2013. And that extends to the United States. For population-weighted fine particulate matter levels, which is usually a surrogate for air pollution, we actually have levels that are less than a quarter of the global average. So we're talking about setting standards between 12 and 9 micrograms. The global average is above 30. As you consider important changes to modernize the Clean Air Act, including those that create unnecessary permitting delays, there are 4 issues I'd like to highlight with the Act. First, it's desperately in need of overhaul and modernization, although it has served us very well. Many provisions have fallen into disrepair and obsolescence. Second, all too often in the past, US EPA has second-guessed state plans, permits, and demonstrations, including when such oversight is not timely or is not grounded firmly in the Clean Air Act. Third, EPA has often failed to incorporate, consider, or address the growing role of significant air pollution concentrations from background, natural, international, fire, geographically distinct, and mobile sources. Finally, EPA relies on a 2-tiered permitting system that discourages investment in newer modified facilities that emit less air pollution, and it also creates perverse incentives for older grandfather facilities. H.R. 161 and recent EPA changes would go a long way to address that 2-tiered system. Similarly, the Fire Act would remove important confusion that currently exists that limits the applicability of regulatory relief for Clean Air Act provisions on exceptional events. The Fences Act would take many important steps to clarify Clean Air Act provisions to avoid unnecessary penalties in areas like Northwest Indiana, where they would have attained the NAAQS but for international contributions. My written testimony contains a number of other examples of potential opportunities for common sense and bipartisan agreement to modernize the Clean Air Act. Our agency stands ready to assist the subcommittee as it considers the important legislative changes. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Hi, thanks, Mr. Stein. I want to start with you. We're talking about permitting reform, and I think we're going to work together on permitting reform across the aisle. The issue is permitting reform means a lot of things to a lot of people. We permit a lot of things at the federal level. So I guess my question is, permitting for energy, we want to permit because we need more energy and we want to bring back manufacturing. So how significant is the Clean Air Act's role in permitting process in a business decision to invest and build? And can we have meaningful permitting reform without modernizing the Clean Air Act?
Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Full Committee Chair. The answer, great question. The answer is, I don't believe you can have long-term certainty without reforming and modernizing the Clean Air Act. Because again, there's little things we can do, and we're seeing it, and they're exciting, and they're hopeful. This leadership team at the EPA right now has provided hope and pathways for some of my members in Arizona, as well as, I would argue, around the country. However, there's no certainty that in the next administration that will still be there. So one of the most meaningful and significant ways you can lock down long-term investment is provide the certainty in the regulatory environment that we could have. And I think the investment would follow very soon after that. People will feel comfortable. The delays would go away. So while there's things you can do and you can nip around the edges, the Clean Air Act should be modernized. It should be changed to reflect what we've learned, what science has taught us, and where we are now, and that will trigger more investment and allow us to compete better with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. So I know one of my great colleagues, Mr. Westerman, Chair Westerman's working on NEPA reform. A lot of people think NEPA reform is permitting reform, so I kind of the same theme. So the NEPA process, it has to have more, we have to have reforms to the Clean Air Act generally. Would you comment on that as well?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. I think it's, 35 years is a long time. There's a lot of concepts, there's a lot of technology and ability to model and understand where the contributions to potential non-attainment areas come from. The tools need to be updated, and while I think the Clean Air Act has served us extremely well, I think there's a number of changes, including invigorating some of those provisions for regulatory relief related to international transport, exceptional events, rural transport areas, but also how EPA sets standards, designates areas as attainment, non-attainment, and reclassifies areas are desperately in need of a 21st century vision that I think some of the bills under consideration today would go a long way towards.
All right, thank you. And Ms. Coons, and in Micron's experience, how essential is clean air permitting reform to your continued expansion and race to win for AI dominance, and what risk does our country face if Congress fails to modernize the Clean Air Act?
Thank you, Chairman. What we have experienced on our end is a lengthy, duplicative permitting process. In fact, in one of our key investments within New York, we have undergone environmental permitting for the last 2.5 years. So what we are looking for is meaningful streamline and reform in this space that will allow us to enable our investments from everything from construction start to operations. By streamlining this, we can continue to modernize our facilities and be at the backbone of semiconductor manufacturing here within the United States.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Jebbia, this committee has recognized the need for almost all of our hearings about energy production to fuel demand for AI and to beat China to AI. So what impact does regulatory uncertainty have on your industry and its ability to meet the increased demand? And what is permitting reform necessary to ensure the Clean Air Act reflects technological developments, is not an impediment to needed energy infrastructure?
Thank you, Chairman. This committee has been doing some outstanding work on trying to evaluate these issues, and the need is current and in front of us, that without certainty, we go through an entire permitting process and then have confidence to deploy capital. Just by driving the durable policy and regulatory certainty that this committee is working on, it provides the opportunity to speed up significantly our ability to deploy power generation behind the meter, particularly to support the AI race.
Okay, so, and Mr. Woods, in your experience in the 309 review process where EPA does secondary review, is this still necessary, and how do you respond to testimony we've heard today on the Red Tape Act?
Yeah, I think it is not necessary in its current form. I think it adds very little value, and frankly, there's not clear criteria for EPA to provide that feedback on other federal agency actions. It often serves as another source of delay. It often duplicates processes that we have at other state and federal levels. So I think there is a real opportunity with that bill to clarify and provide reduced red tape that will allow us to get to a more clear vision for the future and EPA's role in weighing in on other federal agency actions.
Thank you. I appreciate all you for being here. We really do want this committee and all of us to find common ground together. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to continuing the work after this hearing. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Tonko, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to reiterate my overall concerns about these bills, but I would try to focus my questions on the air permitting improvements to protect National Security Act. As I stated in my opening statement, I want to see advanced manufacturing facilities built in our United States. They are a huge part of upstate New York's near and long-term economic development strategy. But it has to be done the right way, and creating a non-transparent presidential exemption process, as proposed in the discussion draft, is simply not the right way. Seeing this proposal, I'm reminded of EPA's actions earlier this year, where the administrator created an email inbox and encouraged regulated entities to request a presidential exemption under Section 112I-4 of the Clean Air Act for standards related to hazardous air pollutants. Ms. Powell, have you been following that exemption process?
Thank you, Ranking Member Tonko. Yes, SELC has been following that process very carefully, and we've observed that over the last several months, the president has exempted dozens of toxic air pollution emitting facilities from control requirements. And this is especially concerning because it's done without any record of decisions so that people can see why it's being done. It's done without any public participation. And we're finding that the facts on the ground don't even support the exemptions. We have a facility in Georgia that is, according to the state, already fully complying with the federal rule, and yet the exemption is issued on the basis that the technology is somehow not available. And so I 100% agree that the type of presidential exemption that is spelled out in the National Security Act is problematic, and it will put the public health at risk of being exposed to increased levels of air pollution that can cause devastating health problems.
And in accordance with your response here, I believe that I can interpret that the exemption has the opportunity to be misused.
Absolutely. It has the opportunity to be misused because there is so little accountability in ensuring that there's even a reason for it to happen. And of course, we're talking about communities where the air quality is already unsafe to breathe. That's the only time offsets apply.
Well, giving the presidential discretion based on broad, undefined national security interests allows pollution sources to evade a formal process that would allow for public input and a transparent public record. Instead, we would be giving tremendous latitude to the president, who wouldn't even need to justify the decision to offer these exemptions. So, Ms. Powell, again, do you believe the recent exemptions to facilities for various hazardous air pollutant standards provided a strong technical record or justification that the public could examine to understand why exemptions were granted?
The recent presidential exemptions have no technical record that's available. In fact, we've struggled to even get copies of the applications that the facilities have filed. And unbelievably, the state agencies that have primary authority to regulate those facilities also don't have the applications.
Appreciate that. Mr. Mirza-Khalili, generally, do you have any potential concerns as a co-regulator that facilities located in your state may be escaping pollution standards without any oversight or opportunity to have the state's perspectives heard?
Ranking Member Tonko, I presume you're referring to the that National Security Act again. We are fortunate in Oregon, we don't have non-attainment. We are attainment for all pollutants. But certainly, I think what you would point out here in terms of facilities that get a waiver, be it presidential waiver or a waiver for another requirement, it puts pressure on other facilities that don't qualify for a waiver. As the requirements for one facility is waived, the pollution doesn't go away. It goes back to the background. Then other facilities will have to make up the difference and in order for us to attain the standard. It's not a level playing field.
And under this specific waiver proposal, can you talk about some of the potential unintended consequences? Could other facilities, for example, be required to reduce their emissions more or find more offsets to balance the exemptions provided to these favored industries?
That's exactly right, and it's the subsidy that introduces here for one facility to do other. It's not a waiver from the state to meet the obligation to meet them.
The chair would ask the witness to submit the answers for the record. Our 5 minutes has expired, unfortunately. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for his 5 minutes.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I just want to start out by saying if we want to beat China in the AI and advanced manufacturing race, we can't regulate ourselves into industrial decline. And the Clean Air Act's permitting system is indeed outdated, and projects that should be greenlit in months take years, if they happen at all. You know, companies that go beyond compliance to cut emissions, they get punished with additional red tape. And energy like natural gas that has lowered emissions, it becomes a boogeyman for the radical left. None of this overregulation makes our air cleaner. It kills investment, it delays cleaner technology, and it drives industry overseas, stifling American job growth in these vital sectors and really just passing along pollution somewhere else. We've made enormous progress on clean air, I might add. I mean, emissions of the 6 criteria pollutants are down more than 70% since 1970. So we should be building on that success. And permitting reform, first of all, it does not tear up the Clean Air Act. It makes it work for today's challenges, and it restores some common sense. So the question is simple. Do we want to lead the world in innovation and energy security, or do we want to follow Europe's path of overregulation and decline? I'll start with Ms. Coons. To lead in artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing, we can't afford to build factories at the speed of bureaucracy while China's building at the speed of strategy. Now, from your perspective, how does permitting gridlock put U.S. innovation and therefore national security at risk?
From our experience and in our perspective, our projects have faced delay, and in some cases, we have not been able to start meaningful construction, therefore delays in operations. Duplicative reviews at the state, local, and federal level, along with lack of resourcing and modernization of tools, create lengthy processes. And what we are asking is for review in streamlining the permitting application process for permittees and those reviewing applications.
Appreciate that. And Mr. Woods, I'll move to you. Your testimony talks about how the EPA second guesses a lot of state permitting decisions. How would common sense reform that trusts states more instead of federal micromanagement speed up clean air progress and investment at the same time?
Thanks so much, Vice Chairman. I think it's a great question. I think we are seeing some important changes right now where with the new administration coming in. I think there's a couple of examples. So just this week, As a result of an AI roundtable, there was an announcement of a new policy, really a readoption of an old policy at EPA related to second guessing of states and permittees' applicability determinations for new source review. A great example. In my testimony, I lay out a little bit more about how sometimes the Title V review process that is overseen by EPA, either to object or to grant third-party petitions to state overseen permits, expands issues that are not within that key provision of the act, and that narrowing that review process would go a long way to ensure that you don't have delays in key projects, and that state-led delegated programs that work effectively in providing environmentally protective and legally durable permits could move much more quickly. And so we're seeing in real time, but I think some of the legislation discussed today could potentially really help to address that.
Some of these, on this duplicative process problem at the state and federal level, do you have any examples on hand that we could put in for the record?
We do. I think of right now for us, for example, the 2024 fine particulate matter standard of 9 micrograms really serves as a limit to headroom. So while most of the state we expect to be in attainment with that legally and scientifically dubious standard, it really limits the ability of new investment to come in, whether that's a data center, new energy generation, opportunity for advanced manufacturing. And so that really is a limiting factor in a state like ours that intends to be in full attainment with all national ambient air quality standards, and yet the lack of headroom under the revised standard is a serious issue for us and many other states around the country.
Mr. Gebbia, the Biden administration had imposed regulatory obstacles after regulatory obstacle on the economy. We know we're seeing a lot of good reforms under the new EPA and under Lee Zeldin. What do you think this means, or are we seeing what this might mean for private investment into reliable energy infrastructure? And what would you prioritize for Congress to codify?
Yeah, there's been some very helpful work done so far, but as we've recently talked on this panel, congressional action will provide that permanence. Some of the key issues that the administration is looking into, really a big one is being able to begin construction ahead of receiving a permit. This is not changing the environmental outcome of anything. It's adding time to the construction and being able to bring projects in service. So taking a look not only from a regulatory action, but also from congressional action on that issue could be extremely helpful.
And maybe you can send it to us later, but examples of that would be very helpful. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Votes have been called on the House floor, so the subcommittee stands in recess. We'll reconvene 10 minutes after the final vote is called. The committee's in recess. The Subcommittee on the Environment in the Energy and Commerce Committee will now reconvene. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there are almost 100,000 people in the United States of America who die because of air pollution. That's a lot of people. And I don't quite understand why it is so important that we deal with this particular piece of legislation in a very narrow view of how does a particular kind of business needs to be done and add to the pollution that kills almost 190,000 people. I mean, we also have other ways of getting the important work done, but not for these particular witnesses who are here today, who need to do it in a different way. And I don't understand, I really don't understand why it is not the #1 priority to try and keep people, children, adults, older people, safer so that they don't end up being sick and dying. I really don't understand the priorities that are being set here, and those that are left out of thinking about what are the consequences of this kind of work. So I wanted to ask Mr. Ali, if I could use that name. Are there going to be more people who get sick and perhaps even die by making this change in what is the priority in our manufacturing?
Representative, thank you for the question, and I appreciate you highlighting the problem here. That's highly critical, essential for us to consider. Clean Air Act, as we've mentioned, has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. We're talking about increased pollution that can harm people. That is being, what do you call it, exemption, waiver. It just contributes to additional pollution we're trying to allow. And it's interesting to note that both Ms. Coons and Seiden's facilities, although they're complaining about the permitting process, they have the permits. They obtained the permits for the facilities, they built it, they're operating within the compliance with the Clean Air Act, so it works. I appreciate the fact that it is hard and it's been a painful process. So we need to focus on process and process improvement. And I'm all eager to engage in that. I think state agencies are eager to engage in that. How do we do things better? How do we issue permits in a shorter time period? Not to how, we, out of frustration, exempt facilities from permitting requirement. We create off-ramps and waivers for things that are necessary to protect public health. So this is essential. I think it's the crux of the matter, and I think you hit the nail on the head, that we need to make sure these exemptions, these processes, these bypasses cause excess pollution, particularly some of them, as Ms. Powell points out here in the testimony, it's in areas that are already polluted, and people are suffering from the consequences of unhealthful air.
I appreciate your comment. I wanted to ask Ms. Powell. Yeah, okay, Ms. Powell. And I appreciated your presentation very much. I wanted to ask you, my understanding is that the EPA has a way of helping companies and working in a way that ends up with, work still happens, but we can make it safer. And that there's a way that the EPA helps encourage that. Is that not true?
That's absolutely true. I used to work for EPA, and I worked together with technical staff at EPA to issue permits for some types of facilities, and we routinely answered questions of the applicants and helped them through the process. I know state and local agencies that have permitting authority do the same thing.
Thank you, and the time has expired. I now recognize myself for my 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Woods, my first question will be to you. In Colorado, we know that roughly 70% of the emissions in the state of Colorado don't originate from the state of Colorado, and so when through things like the Clean Air Act, we heavily regulate the economy, we're not actually getting to the root of the problem, which is where these emissions are coming from. And what we end up doing is regulating the economy, losing jobs, losing the cost of living that's so important to people, which has negative outcomes for folks, because if they don't have the money, they're not going to go get preventative care. They're going to delay going to the doctor. Health outcomes go down. And so the question to you is, if you were in our position, what reforms would you prioritize in the permitting process so that our economy isn't strangled by events outside of the control of whatever the particular jurisdiction is?
Thanks so much for the question. I think it's a really timely one, and one that is not limited to Colorado, and where I think there are national solutions that already exist within the Clean Air Act, but also could be invigorated with action by this body. So I'll say we are very similar. In Northwest Indiana, I mentioned previously, we've got 3 parts of our 92 counties that are in partial non-attainment with ozone or sulfur dioxide standards. And at least for Northwest Indiana, of the standard of 70 parts per billion, between 4 and 13 parts per billion come from local sources that my agency regulates. The rest comes from international and interstate, from upwind states, but also from natural and biogenic, and increasingly from fire sources. There are provisions in the Act to address exceptional events that are becoming increasingly unexceptional, including our ability to characterize wildfire contributions. There are provisions that allow you to address the contributions of international, where you would have attained the standard, but for those international contributions, and we're increasingly able to say 10, 15, 20 parts per billion of a 70 part per billion standard comes from those international and boundary conditions. So I think there's an opportunity to utilize those tools. I also think resources to state agencies are probably another area where core categorical grants for cooperative federalism, it's a very minor investment, but the certainty that comes with authorization of those appropriations that hasn't happened this century is absolutely critical for your state permitting authorities, with some light oversight, but also helpful guidance from EPA can really invigorate those permitting programs to get improved environmental outcomes, but also improved economic activity in states like Colorado.
Thank you so much. Mr. Seiden, next question goes to you. Colorado, Arizona, obviously we have some similar situations going on there. I think back to what the chair of our, I guess he's executive director of our Regional Air Quality Council said, talking about ozone non-attainment, where he said we could get rid of driving, we could get rid of oil and gas in the state of Colorado, and we still wouldn't meet our summertime ozone standards. And so my question to you, representing a lot of economic interests, which of course, as we've talked about, leads to improved health outcomes for folks when they have the resources to be able to go get that early and preventative care. What happens to the economy of a region when you have this heavy hand of regulation that doesn't actually clean up the environment because it's targeting the wrong emissions? What happens to the jobs and to the economy?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, and you are absolutely right. What happens is very simple. Capital always goes where it's most wanted and stays where it's most welcome. So if you have an uncertain regulatory environment, that capital will go elsewhere. We will lose these jobs. And if they were to, I'm a competitive person, if they were to go to another state, I'd begrudgingly would tip my hat to that state and that governor. But what we're seeing happen is often they're going to other countries that have lower standards. We're seeing them go to places where we don't track the pollution as well. And then the worst part of that all is we know it still ends up in our region. And that is something that Colorado and Arizona have in common. We are in that western region where this international transport is coming from areas we can't control. And so again, we have a perverse incentive to manufacture outside of our country, take our jobs away, yet also make our air worse.
Thank you. I got 1 minute left. Mr. Gebbia, a final question to you. We just heard that when you have this heavy hand of regulation that doesn't actually target the actual source of these emissions, with much of it coming from overseas and international transport, we're strangling our own economy and we still don't get clean air out of it. So is there anything Congress can do to make sure that states aren't intentionally ignoring existing waiver processes or exceptions to the Clean Air Act around certain industries, regulated industries like natural gas? 31 seconds.
Thank you for the question. The Clean Air Act has been extremely successful in what's been achieved to date. But with the issues we're talking about today are really new source review, which is stationary sources where most of those emissions have been reduced over time. So it is getting to the point of diminishing returns. And I think Congress can take action to help solidify ways to reform new source review to help facilitate expansion of projects and focus on the environmental outcome of them.
Thank you so much. My time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bills before us today paint the picture that the only way we can build things in America is if we exempt various polluting industries from environmental laws, permit by permit. But I think that's a false choice. And contrary to the history of the Clean Air Act, we know that we can have a clean environment and a booming economy, and to say otherwise is to doubt American innovation and to put communities living in areas with toxic air pollution at great risk. So I have 3 questions. First is of Ms. Powell. Why is effective permitting so critical to the success of the Clean Air Act? And in your experience, what is causing permitting delays for major projects, if you will?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Permitting is incredibly important in achieving the Clean Air Act's goals because it's really how the standards are set for most facilities. You can have the best rules, the best statute, but if you don't have robust permitting, the public is not going to receive the promises of the Clean Air Act for healthy air quality. As far as what causes delays, there are myriad things that might cause delays that often don't even have to do with anything in the Clean Air Act, but sometimes companies will put blame on that. Another thing that will happen is that companies won't file complete permit applications or supplement the record with information that they need to provide. My experience is that companies that are serious about complying with the Clean Air Act and not trying to skirt its requirements, they eventually get their permits. And the investment in time up front helps ensure that they are solid, protective permits that are less likely to be struck down when they're challenged if they have been done properly and with proper public participation.
All right, thank you. My second question is of Mr. Mirzakulili. You have extensive experience running state-level Clean Air Act permitting programs, and are these broad exemptions necessary, or can we have a permitting system that works for industry while adhering to environmental safeguards?
We absolutely can have a system that operates without those exemptions. The exemptions do nothing but complicate applicability determinations. The first argument shouldn't be whether or not something is subject to the rule, and that's where we spend a lot of time. And up front, who is subject to the rule? Are the hourly emissions higher or lower? What does the future actual of the emissions look like? And what is that? If it doesn't happen in the future, what is that future action? How do you calculate that? How do you make that enforceable? So that adds a tremendous level of complexity to the process that's unnecessary. If we clarify who is subject to the rule, and then we'll focus on streamlining and making the process easier to get through it. And there's a number of recommendations I could make to make that happen, but yes.
All right, well, thank you, because, I'm concerned that Republicans push for so-called permitting reform legislation, but that's not happening in a silo. The Trump administration has been busy trying to roll back and undermine the PM 2.5 NAAQS standard and other protections that ensure Americans have safe air to breathe. And I think we have to consider all of these actions as we evaluate these bills. But let me go back to Ms. Powell. Taken collectively, how will the administration's proposal to weaken the PM 2.5 NAAQS standard, along with additional rollbacks and exemptions being proposed in the legislation before us, impact the health and safety of communities around the country?
These rollbacks will undoubtedly harm public health. Fine particulate matter is among the most deadly of air pollutants. These particles are so small that they wedge their way deep into people's lungs and into their bloodstreams. They've been associated with stroke, heart disease, developmental delays in children. So rolling back these requirements is a really serious threat to public health.
I appreciate that because, look, I think everyone has the right to clean and healthy air to breathe, but the Republican bills would undermine that right and once again put the well-being of corporate polluters over the American people. And the Clean Air Act works because of its health protection standards and enforcement and permitting programs, not despite them, frankly. So, and that's why I oppose the bills before us today. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Woods, thank you for joining us. Your testimony highlights how states can be unfairly penalized for air pollution that they can't control, whether it drifts across borders, international state borders, a number of things, whether it stems from wildfires, natural sources, the Foreign Emissions and Non-Attainment Clarification for Economic Stability, or the Fences Act, aims to correct that problem by making sure that states aren't labeled as non-attainment when the pollution is literally out of their hands. And your testimony points out that non-attainment designations can delay permits, hurt economic growth, and don't actually get after the problem that they're trying to solve. So I want to ask a couple of questions. How would clarifying Section 179B, as the Fences Act proposes, reduce permitting delays or protect the environment better than what we're actually doing right now?
It's a great question, and I apologize in advance for perhaps being a little bit long-winded. This is something I'm very passionate about, and I think the bill goes a long way to clarify this provision that allows for state agencies like ours to capture the right moment. So as EPA thinks about international background, other sources that are outside the control of a local agency as the primary regulator of air quality, there are several points in which the agency could consider it. When it sets the standards, when it does designations of an area initially, when it looks at redesignating those areas into attainment or non-attainment, when it reclassifies, as my testimony lays out in great detail, as you get in non-attainment and then higher classifications from marginal to moderate to serious to severe to extreme, the penalties on permitting, on transportation funds and transportation conformity, on fuel requirements become much more heavy-handed and can just devastate and strangle economic growth and are really at the core of the permitting issue. So we want the whole country to be in attainment, but the 179B provision is actually to avoid getting bumped up beyond marginal to those more significant penalties. So in this case, I think the provision clarifies, and this bill would clarify for EPA what I think they could do already, which is to grant demonstrations by states that show that they would have attained but for those international contributions. And when we're talking about 5, 10, 20 parts per billion of a 70 part per billion standard coming from Canada, Mexico, Asia, and elsewhere, that's what puts you over the top to a 72 or 75 part per billion design value and would have an incredible impact on the opportunities for eliminating those delays in permitting, economic activity, and innovation that would also bring down emissions overall.
The fear-mongering that we just heard, and the lack of actual work with industries that do want to comply with this type of thing. And I can point back to a variety of visits, including the Region 6 director under President Biden, who came to my area and was amazed at the monitoring that we actually had out there. But they never once thought, and especially when they lowered the parts per million requirement, they never, through a rule, just a unilateral rule, they never once thought about talking to industry. So they're actually not solving the problems, and we want to be realistic about it. I'll turn to Ms. Coons and talk about infrastructure and the AI game that we know is here. And just looking at the data centers, the semiconductor facilities, and other advanced manufacturing, we've heard from several witnesses that the current Clean Air Act permitting, especially the prevention of significant deterioration in the Title V requirements, can add years to project timelines. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about Micron is building multiple large semiconductor fabrication facilities across the country. How can the Clean Air Act permitting timelines influence the schedule and the cost of these projects while not necessarily achieving the desired goals?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. From this perspective, what we have seen is a lengthy environmental permitting and review process that where we have duplicative reviews in some cases, we have interagency coordination of up to tens of agencies where oftentimes we may receive conflicting guidance. So within this, to streamline that process and remove those particular barriers within the application process itself would be critically important to ensuring that we can start construction on time and deliver for our operational needs that will ultimately bring products, our product to market for everything from automobiles to electronics to AI.
You mentioned, you described wildfire smoke as an uncontrollable factor in meeting the new PM 2.5 standards. And I know this has been discussed already, but what kind of regulatory clarity or legislative action would help alleviate that?
Thank you, Congressman. I mean, I think in this particular space, we really need to look at codifying the definitions further of natural versus human-caused wildfire. These definitions will provide meaningful clarity to applicants and permittees.
Thank you. And Chairman, I think the work that the Chevron deference case had with clarity to this body, to be specific, is really important, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really glad there's so much bipartisan support about permit reform, which is something I've been interested in and passionate about for a long time. Really happy with the Fix Our Forests Act, which was co-authored by Chair Westerman and I, make strong permitting reforms to forest management practices and project litigation, increasing public participation and lowering air pollution. One of the concerns we have is underlying smoke pollution. That bill, assuming we had full attendance, was only 2 votes away from passing the House on suspension earlier this year, and I hope the Senate acts quickly to pass their version of the bill. Last Congress, I worked with Senators Kelly and Cruz on the Building Chips in America Act, which passed the House with more than 2/3 of the vote. It was signed into law by President Biden. That bill provided permitting certainty to semiconductor manufacturers who are investing billions of dollars in America. And I was really happy to see the E-Permit Act, my bill with Rep. Johnson from South Dakota, being discussed last week in Natural Resources. That bill would digitize the permitting process and increase both transparency and efficiency. I spent a lot of my time talking and complaining about the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the 3 bills I just described are great examples of very bipartisan, smart reforms. A core part of my argument for reform on NEPA is that it's a procedural act. As one of the witnesses said, it's a lot of paperwork, but it doesn't actually contain substantive environmental protections like the bedrock environmental laws, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. Those laws actually prescribe standards for compliance. They provide real protections against environmental harm. And so I'm cautious about making changes to the standards, although I think I really would like to advance the speed. And I would like to work together as we go forward to make sure we do that. Ms. Coons, I want to ask you, the bills before us are focusing on the permitting under the Clean Air Act. My sense was that wasn't really the issue that was causing your delays. Can you speak to the environmental laws that were causing the delays for your project? And maybe if you have an opinion about how the E-Permit Act, with some process reforms around deadlines and timelines, could help you address those.
Thank you, Congressman. From our perspective, the delays that we have seen to several of our projects are due to, large in part, the environmental impact review process, as well as the duplicative and lengthy nature within that. And additionally, we have also seen long, complicated reviews as it pertains to the Clean Air Act, specifically within the permitting process itself. So when we look at that, we believe that there are ways to modernize the permitting process when an applicant is going through that they can use modern tools, electronic databases to achieve accuracy and a more streamlined process.
Right. I'm nervous about lowering standards. I want high environmental standards, but I see no reason why we can't get there much more quickly with a lot less drag on industry and the economy, and that's my goal. Mr. Mirzakaleli? Based on your testimony, it seems we both agree on the need to manage our forests, including using prescribed fire. Are there ways that the federal government can help reduce the regulatory burden on states that are trying to use prescribed fire as a wildfire tool? And do you have any opinion on whether the Fire Act, which we're discussing today, addresses those challenges?
Yeah, Representative Peters, thank you for that question. And yes, there are, prescribed fires can help bring resilience to the landscape by a great deal. So we are working with our other agencies in Oregon to try expand the use of prescribed fires. Where we run into trouble with the, right now the exceptional events exclusion is a tool for us to reduce this, but it's complicated. For the 24-hour designation, we submitted about 100 the exceptional event submittals here to it. It's illegitimately. Then some of that requires almost a master's degree level demonstration of submittal. It shouldn't be. There's a, the fire is almost burning down my monitoring site. It shouldn't require a whole lot of submission other than, there wasn't. So there are ways that EPA can improve the process of and ease the submittal of exceptional events and the burden for the agencies. There are also some that EPA considers not regulatory significant, meaning it did not cause the area to be in non-attainment, therefore you don't flag that. I think that's important to exclude them as well.
Sir,
and that's an area that we need to focus on.
Great, I'm out of time. We'll just say, Mr. Chairman, I'm reticent to lower standards, but I'm anxious to accelerate deadlines and timelines, and hope we can work together on that. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez.
Thank you, Chairman. The Clean Air Act helps our nation achieve both clean air and a strong economy. Permitting is a key component of this bedrock environmental law, moving industry forward while promoting healthy air quality. And before we get into the permitting part of this conversation, Ms. Powell, I quickly want to touch base on all the work that the Clean Air Act has done and the lives and health that's improved over the last several decades. Just quickly, would you agree that particulate matter is among the most dangerous forms of air pollution and is linked to many serious health problems, including cancer, stroke, and heart disease?
Yes, absolutely.
And has the Clean Air Act worked to reduce the volume of particulate matter in our air?
It has. It has been tremendously successful.
And so, but we shouldn't take that success for granted. And I think it's especially dangerous to think about any modifications to the Clean Air Act in this moment, because in this Congress alone, Republicans have voted on a reconciliation bill that will take health care away from 15 million people, many of whom rely on Medicaid and state-administered Medicaid programs to get their health care. So people that may need Medicaid to be their lifeline to health care may also be in communities that are overburdened by adverse environmental consequences like air pollution, particulate matter. And so it seems like an especially dangerous time to be making modifications to the Clean Air Act when you're thinking about potentially 15 million people losing health care. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. And the fact that there's so many people that are at risk of losing health care or are inadequately getting health care right now means that they're more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution.
That's right. And I think about, I represent parts of Newark, including the Ironbound neighborhood. And what you see there in an overburdened community is the asthma rates among children. So as successful as the Clean Air Act has been, there's still an immense amount of work to do so we ensure that all communities and all children have clean air throughout this country. Would you agree with that? I
would absolutely agree with that. And we heard one testifier mentioning that there were diminishing returns from the Act. That is absolutely not true. The Act is as important now as it has always been.
Yeah, I agree with that. In June, Mr. John Walk from the Natural Resources Defense Council testified before this committee and said that he would support finding ways to expedite permitting rules and processes through updated guidance and regulation so long as the Clean Air Act is upheld and its critical protections remain in place. Ms. Powell, would you agree with Mr. Walk's statement?
I would. Certainly, revisions to regulations or policies as needed to make permitting more efficient, they're certainly worthy of consideration so long as they continue to protect public health. And
that's exactly right. And that's what Mr. Peters and I were discussing earlier today, because he's been a leading Democratic voice on permitting reform. We want to engage in the conversation about how we streamline some of these processes, but not at the expense of the health of our communities. And just a quick follow-up, do you believe that the bills in discussion here today would achieve those priorities of expediting permitting rules and processes through updated guidance and regulation?
I do not. They are far more focused on stripping away fundamental Clean Air Act protections that are needed to ensure that people across the country have healthy air quality.
Right, and we've touched on some of the issues that folks face when they're trying to work their way through these various regulations, but we also have to acknowledge the catastrophic staffing and funding cuts at the Trump administration's EPA. We have to acknowledge that we're not building capacity at state agencies that issue permits. Would you agree that that's a route that we could take to make these processes more streamlined in an effective and thoughtful way?
Mr. Menendez, absolutely. That's when we get down to it, it's a resource issue for states and guidance.
Yeah, and so that's what I think is so frustrating, because the majority frames these conversations as we're looking at permitting reform, but they're really just cherry picking things out of the Clean Air Act that aren't a holistic approach to how we actually address the challenges that industry are facing. And on this side of the aisle, we want to see renewable energy, clean energy get online quicker. So that's why we want to engage in the conversation, but this is not really the most artful way to do it. And it's misleading to tell the American people we're going to sit here and have a conversation about energy, or about permitting reform, when it's really hand-selected approaches that undermine the Clean Air Act, when, as we previously discussed, there's so much more work that we have to do to ensure that every American, and especially every American child, is breathing clean air. We can do that work together. I would love to do it in a bipartisan way, but in my opinion, that's not what we're doing here today. So thank you all so much for coming. By the way, my wife's from Indiana, so go Hoosiers.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes for his question. No, I'm sorry. Mr. Landsman from Ohio.
This guy. No worries. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there's clearly, I think there's a commitment to do bipartisan permitting reform. It does require both sides to get in a room and hash out those details. And there are folks on both sides that have worked on this. It's not clear to me that we're talking about a bipartisan permitting bill, but I wanted to get at a few things. We are talking in large part about clean air, clean water, and there are serious questions about whether or not these reforms would in fact lead to dirtier air and dirtier water, which we want to avoid. One of the things that makes a huge difference right now is the Office of Research and Development at the EPA. They only do clean air and water work, and I've got a big ORD office in my district. Amazing human beings, incredible scientists and researchers, and they help businesses and municipalities deal with clean air and clean water concerns. I was frustrated, as you can imagine, by the EPA's decision to shutter the Office of Research and Development and threaten the jobs of nearly 1,200 dedicated public servants. It is, I'd argue, the ORD, the scientific backbone of the EPA. Ms. Powell, how did the EPA's work within ORD before the EPA or the administrator's decision around ORD, how did it support the EPA's ability to address toxic air pollution?
The Office of Research and Development played an absolutely essential role in helping evaluate the health effects of air toxics. And I have an example that's been really important in the state of Georgia, where I'm based. In around 2016, ORD assessed ethylene oxide that comes from medical sterilizers and determined that ethylene oxide is far more carcinogenic than had previously been thought. The state of Georgia took that information and they moved forward quickly to put in place strong standards in permits. They established them in permits to regulate ethylene oxide. And the state legislature acted as well based on that information to adopt strong legislation. EPA took that information and strengthened their federal standard. Unfortunately, that's one of the standards that the president has recently exempted many facilities from and is talking about rolling back. But ORD played a really important role in helping people understand the risks presented by that pollutant and identified communities at risk all across the country.
Yeah, I was over there touring the other day, and it's amazing how much they do for local communities, again, companies, but also, to your point, state legislatures, and that's where a lot of the permitting reform happens, right? And so I'm curious, this is a question for Mr. Mirzakhali, is that right? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, can you talk a little bit about the specific tools or expertise that ORD has provided to states like yours? Would states face challenges implementing Clean Air Act requirements if those resources were scaled back, if it was harder to get ORD resources?
Representative Landon, absolutely. They provide crucial resources for state permitting agencies, such as modeling tools. We assess the impact of emissions based on the atmospheric models that all are perfected and improved through ORD research. Emissions inventory tools that come along with them, and basic science. They provide guidance. I think for us to have better tools, we need ORD.
Can I just ask you and then everybody else? It's also very important for ORD, these scientists, to remain independent, right? I mean, to remain independent from political appointees and potential pressure from them. Yes or no?
Yes.
Ms. Powell? Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Indiana? Sure. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Woods, I think everybody here should know, if they don't know already, that we're in an arms race for artificial intelligence and quantum computing with China. And in order to meet that, we're going to have some permitting reform. We're going to have to make some reforms across the board to some of our environmental laws. I think we can do that with no harm to environmental quality. I worked, in a previous life, I worked for 2 international engineering companies, one of which is Combustion Engineering, their Environmental Systems Division. I have a pretty good understanding of what has to be done to maintain our air quality, water quality, land quality. How do you think it would impact our ability to build out our data centers, and particularly to power those data centers, if we don't have some sensible regulatory reform, permitting reform?
Yeah, I think in the absence, it'll be a real challenge. And obviously you have, competition between states and even in localities, and sometimes these environmental matters and non-attainment with a national ambient air quality standard or other issue can be an important determination in economic development and site selection that is really critical. I think has been echoed by several panelists. As we drive those investments overseas, whether it's in the form of coal-fired power plants or data centers or anything else, we're increasingly able to characterize the degree to which those emissions still impact us to an increasing degree. And as we've brought our standards down, I think there's some real potential ripple effects of not having those investments made here.
But part of this effort to win this arms race includes our ability to secure our own supply chain and refine critical minerals and refine rare earth elements. Ms. Coons, you're planning to expand Micron. Does your product require any refined rare earth elements?
At this time, I'm not an expert in that particular subject, so we will have our team get back to you.
Okay, well, I can tell you with a pretty high degree of certainty that you won't be able to make semiconductors, microchips, a number of other products without refined rare earth elements. And if China decided to cut us off, we get 94% of those from China. There's not a single major refinery for rare earth elements in the entire Western Hemisphere. There's only 9 in the world. 8 of them are in China and 1 is in Malaysia. In order to build these processing and refining facilities, it's going to require an additional increase in power output, not just in addition to what we need for the data centers. Mr. Seiden, we've talked about the consequences from not reforming the outdated provisions of the Clean Air Act for semiconductor plants and large projects. Wouldn't you say that also applies to our ability to provide power for these processing and refining facilities?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. It does impact that. And Arizona, for those of you who don't know, is responsible for 80% of the U.S. copper supply. We are a mining state. It's one of the key components of our economy. And the need for power, before you can even think about building a refinery, before you can think about building smelters, it needs to be settled. And the question of availability, reliability, and affordability on power is everything right now. And permitting reform plays into that perfectly. I can speak on behalf of our state utilities. They're constantly looking for permitting reform.
Well, I'd just like to state for the record, at least from my side of the aisle, that while we support renewable energy, we're not in a race to lead the world in renewable energy. We're in an arms race, again, as I've already said, to win this arms race for artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Mr. Gebbia, how do current outdated provisions and flaws in the Clean Air Act impact our ability to meet growing energy needs and to win this arms race?
I mean, as we talked about here, there is a need for process improvement in the permitting process. And right now, we know that we can deploy behind-the-meter power generation solutions for data centers. We know what the best available technology is to control those emissions. And we face, in certain jurisdictions, lengthy timelines ahead of being able to deploy that power simply for permitting review. So I think an easy reform is to identify that we know what these solutions are. We know what emission limits should be, whether that's going through a PSD-backed program or a non-attainment layer review. And so we should be able to begin deploying much faster with the data that we have available.
Well, I would say this in closing in terms of my questions, is that China understands our environmental laws better than we do, and they constantly use them. They support environmental groups to use them against us because they know what race they need to win. And it's not the race to renewables, it's the race to master artificial intelligence and quantum computing. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia. Buddy, can you take the chair? Mr. Joyce, can you take the chair?
You ready? Okay. Well, thank y'all very much for being here. I know it's been a long day for you, and we appreciate you staying here. This is something that's extremely important. I tell people all the time when business people come into my office, regardless of what sector of our economy it is, whether it be healthcare, whether it be energy or technology, it's always the same thing: permitting, regulations, crushing us. It's really putting a bind on the business world, and it's something that we need to address. And I give the example quite often, and I don't think it's apples and oranges. I think it's very relevant. I have the honor and privilege of representing the 1st Congressional District of Georgia, including the Port of Savannah, the entire coast of Georgia. We deepened that port from 42 foot to 47 foot, and we did that in the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project and finished that project in March of 2022. The permitting for that project started in 1996. I mean, that's just ridiculous. In that period of time, China has started and completed 3 ports. So it is something we need to address, and that's what we're trying to do. We're talking about the Clean Air Act, and that's one of the landmark pieces of legislation that must be reformed if we're going to tackle this issue. You know, it's been 3 decades since anything has really been changed, since any real changes have been made to the Clean Air Act. And Ms. Coons, based on your testimony, you are all too familiar with how stringent the PM 2.5 standards are hampering development in America. In June, we had another hearing that included my bill, the CLEAR Act, which would prevent EPA from penalizing exceptional events such as wildfires or preventative actions such as prescribed burns when looking at the Clean Air Act. Can you tell me about how wildfires in and around Idaho impact your ability to comply with the Clean Air Act?
Thank you, Congressman. From our perspective, when we look at wildfires specifically, we're urging for more codification around the definitions of human versus natural events, and which can only help the permitting and application process by removing the uncertainty and lack of clarity within this space.
That's certainly true. I mean, you know, if you're going from 12 to 9 like had been proposed and the baseline is at 8 and you have a wildfire, I mean, you don't have any chance there. And that's what a lot of the companies and the businesses are concerned about. What are some of the consequences we might see in terms of domestic AI development if we don't amend the Clean Air Act or if we don't handle NASC?
Thank you, Congressman. I can't speak specifically to the AI development broadly, but what I can say is that we are the only US-based memory manufacturer with leading-edge technology that supports everything from AI to mobile to automobile.
Great. Mr. Woods, you work as a commissioner for the for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, so that must mean that you're familiar with the implementation process for NASC. In June, I introduced CLEAR Act, and that does a lot to help states comply with NASC, including giving states a a year to make changes to the state implementation plans and extending the review timeline from 5 years to 10 years, allowing for the economic feasibility attainment to be considered and much more. Do you feel like these potential changes would allow you to do your job more effectively and make expectations of your department more realistic?
The short answer is yes, and I think there's a strong state unanimous probably opinion that EPA never meets any of their deadlines. I used to work in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. We get sued almost every day, and so when EPA doesn't meet those deadlines, it means that somebody else is dictating them to them. And for us, I think the implementation tools when an act is amended are incredibly important. For some of our criteria pollutants like carbon monoxide, the underlying science hasn't changed much in 20 years, which is why we haven't changed those standards. For others, we've taken 12 or 13 years. So I think those changes would be incredibly important for state planning, as we have a lot of those obligations as the core implementers of the Clean Air Act.
Let me ask you, Mr. Woods, the Fire Act, I think, is a great piece of common sense legislation. What's your response to that?
I agree. I think there are a number of categories of exceptional events in which there should be, as Mr. Murakashvili mentioned, kind of no-brainers, right? When there's a fire happening in an area, clearly, and there's increasingly those. I will say, whether it's for criteria pollutants or greenhouse gases, when we start to look at the impact of catastrophic wildfire on air quality, a week or two of catastrophic wildfire in California emits more greenhouse gases than an entire year of all energy-related activity in Indiana. So those things are incredibly impactful, and so the ability to ensure that prescribed fire active forest management can reduce the likelihood of those catastrophic wildfires on the whole will result in a dramatic improvement in air quality. That's been the leading driver of increases in PM in any part of the country, and so that I think gets to that core of that issue.
Well, thank you. And again, thank all of you for being here today. But I want to stress one last point, and that is that Americans don't have to choose between clean air and developing our economy. We can do both, and I hope we will do both. So thank you all for being here, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Look relieved, I will be the last. It's been a long day, but your testimony is important to each and every one of us. The need for permitting reform has never been more pressing. I think you know that. Across the country, projects are stalled due to burdensome and unworkable regulations. Economic growth has been stunted by outdated provisions. It's costing American jobs. It's costing American energy. And it's certainly threatening our national security. We continue to face the consequences of tightening regulations despite the fact that the U.S. emissions have consistently decreased over the past 10 years, resulting in America's air quality rating absolutely among the best in the world. To keep America globally competitive, we must ensure that common sense, attainable standards prevail. Mr. Seiden, can you explain the potential consequences that might result from outdated provisions of the Clean Air Act, and secondly, how they will impact industries and their ability to build right here in the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. And yes, I will do my best. It's always hard to quantify all the costs, but we at the Chamber and the members I represent consider very serious consequences will happen if this is not modified, if this is not modernized or modified or changed, because we've seen a stall in companies willing to make decisions, willing to plan ahead. When you're talking multi-billion-dollar investments, when you're talking semiconductors, AI, all the things that we're in this arms race for right now, those decisions aren't made 9 months at a time, 90 days at a time. They're made years in advance, and we need certainty to cement the investments we're going to get for those years. And you are correct. I don't know a single one of those members who wants to skirt any environmental standard. They are the best corporate stewards. We're proud to represent them, and they want to follow all the rules and go above and beyond. But there's just no certainty, and things change, and the planning for that makes it very difficult. So if this is not modernized, we are going to see us being unfairly hamstrung in our competition with other countries, including our foreign adversaries.
And that huge foreign adversary, specifically when it comes to AI, is China. Overburdensome regulations threaten us globally, and that's why I had to mention China. And they encourage companies to build in other countries like China. Ms. Coons, Micron is a leader in one of the fastest growing global industries. I have a two-part question. What consequences will the U.S. face if we fail to enact meaningful permitting reform, and how urgent is it need for that permitting reform if the U.S. wants to remain globally competitive?
Thank you, Congressman. What we've experienced is a very lengthy permitting process that's been occurring for over the last 2.5 years, and we need reform in this particular space so that we can maintain our U.S. competitiveness.
Do you feel that if that reform is in place, that you will once again be competitive, not just competitive here, but competitive worldwide?
Yes, I mean, I can speak to my expertise within the permitting space, and what I can tell you is for our U.S. investments, these extended timelines impact our manufacturing processes and our abilities to bring chips to market. So reforming and ensuring that we have a streamlined permitting process will only help continue to make the semiconductor industry more successful.
Ms. Coons, do you feel that ceding investment opportunities to foreign adversaries who do not have the same clean air requirements not only harms us in the U.S. economically, but it's actually incompatible with the ultimate goal of protecting the environment?
Thank you, Congressman. I can speak to my own experience within the U.S. permitting space for the purposes of health and safety in the environment. And what I can tell you again is that delays and extended timelines in this will impact our manufacturing processes.
We have also seen how the uncertainty of when the new source review process will be triggered and how the expense of undertaking an NSR review has discouraged much-needed investment. Mr. Gibbia, new source review has been used to prevent new economic development in the country and even the retrofit of existing industrial facilities to actually reduce their emissions. How would narrow NSR reforms reduce regulatory burdens on our economy while still protecting human health and still protecting the environment?
Thank you for the question. I think we need to acknowledge that there is a broad regulatory landscape that new source review fits within, and largely it has become outdated. Between new source performance standards and state permitting requirements, it has become a duplicative and slows down our ability to deploy technologies that we know are available.
And that duplicative nature certainly slows our ability to be competitive. It is imperative to balance our public health, and I as a doctor recognize that, and clean air goals, and I again as a doctor recognize that, with the need to attract innovation and economic development in critical industries. If we don't take that immediate action to provide regulatory relief, we will lose out on investment to China and to other competitors, undermining the global competitiveness and putting our economy ultimately at risk. Thank you. Again, I thank all of the witnesses for this long day and for being here till the end. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, so ordered. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to do their best to submit responses within 10 business days of receipts of these questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is now adjourned.